Hey, it's Noor Azizan Gardner. How you doing today?
I'm good, thanks, Matthew.
Good to
It's
see
here
you all those
again.
miles away in America. So, what have you been up to? Anything interesting?
You have time to read a lot, um, and I've just got my latest copy of the Harvard Business Review, and there's a really interesting and important article about trust and how critical trust is in leadership and how do you develop trust. It's just amazing because that's exactly what we need in the world that we live in right now, and with the current issues, the protests that's happening in the United States. Trust is all the more critical at this time.
So, we're talking about trust, and we might come back to that as well. So, you are famous
Mhm.
for setting up a diversity and inclusion department at a major university. So, let's put our rubber to the tarmac, as we say, our wheels to the road. How was your first attempt at getting a multicultural and sophisticated team together? Was it a roaring and complete 100% success?
So I'm going to be very honest. I crashed and burned, um, which was awful, and I think that the I think the team had such the first team. So there are subsequent teams after that. So this is the first team that we're talking about. I think we all had such optimism that the team is going to work, but after a few months, we discombobulated. We internally combusted, and I think that when I look back and when I learn from that, it was really interesting because the element that needed to be there was trust amongst each other and trust that has to happen between them and me with all of them.
No, understood. So, looking back, and we won't mention names for legal reasons, was it a sort of fair weather, good time politeness, which under a bit of pressure cracked? How did it come unraveled?
I think it's funny because when it's fair weather, everybody knew how to interact and talk with each other. That's I'm at a university, so everyone has the knowledge base, all of the courses, all of the you know information that you can have about unconscious bias, implicit bias, racism, dealing with white privilege. Everybody had that in their
Yeah,
heads,
yeah.
right up here. But what did not happen was that when you have a crisis, everything that's up here stays up here. It's not translated into the heart and into action. And I think that the article was really important because it really pointed out three things that has to happen with trust. One has to do with the fact that you really need to be your authentic self. When you are someone who is a minority in the American context, that's in African American, often you don't feel that it's safe to be your authentic self, or that you are from the LGBT community, you don't feel safe.
Yeah.
Even in a diversity office, isn't that interesting? And it was my job to make it feel safe. And I think I did it when we're not in a crisis mode. When it's a crisis mode, people tend to gravitate back to their old self. There's a lot of research in this with difference between fair weather and crisis.
So, being in the non dominant or the protected class, one probably learns the street craft of putting on a mask. LGBT, one might not come
Right,
out. Well, that is
right,
the
exactly.
definition of sporting and supporting a mask.
Right, right.
And of course, that is the opposite of me accessing authenticity or me displaying
Mm-hmm.
authenticity.
That's right. Right. And the other is empathy. I mean, the other that's really interesting. Empathy is really tough.
Yeah.
It's and I don't know about you and the worlds that you live in, but in higher education, academia breeds narcissistic tendencies.
Right.
Perhaps narcissistic people tend to go into academic
Right.
disciplines, but and leadership, but often that translates to individuals not really being empathetic at all. Um,
Yeah. So
and
you have that
so,
literally that sort of narcissistic personality disorder is coming out there, when
Right,
you,
empathy.
yes, you want to fill up on other people's love. That's enough about me. What do you think about me? And all that.
Yes, exactly. But not having empathy is really tough because individuals need that with each other in order to really be themselves and to come up with really brilliant solutions to really difficult issues. And I think that you need to have empathy, and that's often missing. You have to have both authenticity and empathy, and also to trust each other because you trust each other's decisions because you know that it's based on good logic.
Well, okay. So we're coming on to the decision making as well. But going back
Right.
to the empathy, I mean, we look at what's happening all around us, and it seems to be, the muscular white police, the African American citizen living in terror, walking down the street with
Mhm.
some notion of fear. There seems to be, and I'm being very strong here, that there's been a process of dehumanization. You can't kill a human, can't kill a human.
Right.
A human cannot enslave a human. There's been some sort of idea of dehumanization where it's
Mhm.
okay to be videoed doing something absolutely abhorrent,
Mhm.
what seems to be absent is the rehumanizing of the other. That is an absence which we see again and again in many different countries, but in its most
Right.
disgusting form on the internet, recorded there. Any thoughts about that?
I there's a lot of work in this area in humanizing, and I think that you know this as well. um, you can't hurt somebody if the person is a human being, which is one way when you have military or
Yeah, yeah,
you know in the police, for example. The only Actually, it's really interesting because in the military, if you do what the police did in the United States, they would be sent to Fort Leavenworth, thrown into the brig. But the idea of being able to kill in a combative situation
yeah,
means that you have to dehumanize the other. The
yeah,
enemy is
yeah,
the other and not human. Otherwise, a normal human being cannot,
yeah.
in
There's all
good
that
conscience,
research, isn't
do
there? A
that.
soldier cannot kill a soldier, and so there's that
No,
extra training. And if you look at
right.
it, that's the
That's
who
why you
writes the
have
brochure.
PTSD, right?
Yeah, PTSD,
So,
exactly. But who writes the brochure? It's the governments who write the brochure against the
right,
people of a country or race in order to
exactly,
facilitate the war.
exactly.
But when the peace treaty is signed, there's no rehumanizing process. I mean, someone said this week, the Civil War is still going on. The Confederacy lost, but they're not acting as if they've lost. They're acting as if, Tuesday is like Monday. I'm sitting in Britain. Britain has its own place in all of this. We set up the systemic shipping triangle between Africa, the Indies, and the Americas and the UK, and systematized this process. And that same dehumanizing propaganda was very much part of it. The second part was the massive economic gain that came from it. So it was a business model. It was a business
Yes.
model with a massive human cost. Not a lot seems to have changed.
No, and it's insidious actually in the United States because it weaves itself into systems. So
Yeah,
you have in the United States a very insidious systemic oppression still going on.
yeah,
Um, for example, in at universities here, the idea of oppression still lingers in how faculty members get tenured or not.
yeah.
It's not in your face kind
So,
of oppression. It's so just insidious. I mean, that's
it's the art of discrimination, isn't it? It's rather like it's a metaphor. I've got a pile of paper CVs, and I look at the name or I look at the photograph,
right,
and I
right.
just take it out very quietly. It is illegal if you're found, but it saves many legal issues if you get away with it in terms of discrimination. They
Hmm.
won't want to bother with this one. It's sort of empathic discrimination. They won't want this person.
Right,
Very
right,
complicated. It's an
right.
art, isn't it? It's a sneaky art which has
It is
massive consequences.
right, and so and it's and that's still so much a part of this country in the United States. It's not over. It's very much in day-to-day life and
Yeah.
in the world I live in.
Yeah.
And that's really, really difficult when you're trying to change and create a much more equitable world when you're trying to fight systemic racism.
Yeah.
It's tough.
But it seems to be like the demonstrators have already been convinced of the need, though obviously every single human being on earth needs to do much more work for
Right.
themselves, to
Right.
themselves, with
Right.
themselves. But it's the other side who need the changing, and they are just criticizing the looting. And so, we're not really preaching to the right audience to get systemic change.
Mhm.
So there seems to, I mean, are you an optimist or a pessimist? There seems to be a lot of angst, a lot of peer-to-peer empathy. Do you think it
Right.
will result in substantial, is this the push that's going to break it? Or are we going to go back to a fairly fixed and negative system again?
I'm a glass half full
Okay,
sort of person,
okay,
so I'm quite the optimist, and I think it will break. I think we will see changes in a very significant way from this point on. Um, and it's really about acknowledging each other's existence, and
yeah,
that's really important. And also, I think please be mindful of the fact that the conversation cannot just be simply about race. You brought
yeah,
up
yeah,
something
yeah,
very important before we started this. You talk about class
yeah,
as a critical part of this whole conversation as well,
yeah.
and and that they're all sort of integrated in a way. I mean, the literature talks about intersectionality, but sometimes it's lost
Yeah.
in sort of academic sort of
Yeah.
discourse
Yeah.
and not really broken down into really teamwork that you have in companies and in actual offices where you actually have to understand how all of that play in people being able to trust each other.
I love it. Why don't we just finish off today by just bringing back that third point and just really hammering that home, decision making. So we talked about authenticity and empathy and decision making. Are there any criteria that where it's going to work and trust is going to blossom? What do you think?
So I think with decision making, yes, you would trust somebody who is able to use good data in making good decisions. At the same time, you will be able to trust somebody who can communicate your ideas in a very effective way. And what does that mean about communicating? And I think the article that Frey and Morris, they have a suggestion about communication where you have a pyramid, with a pointy end at the top. And that's one way. And they said, well, then people will listen because you put your idea first and then explain what it is. But you and I are interculturalists, and we know that people communicate in different ways,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and often very effectively in different ways. And so I think this is an area that needs to be explored further. How do you communicate such that people trust you? But when you're dealing with different cultures and different subcultures,
Yeah,
and that's
yeah,
an
yeah.
interesting proposition to reflect upon.
No, very good. So we've got even more homework for the viewer in terms of discrimination, racism, unconscious bias, and really it gets back to the intercultural idea of knowing your audience. I can't sell, communicate, build trust, relate to, or be effective in a team unless they understand who I am and who they are. Nice one. No, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I think there's enough material for another 100 of these. The viewers are getting
Yes,
freaked out. Won't be tomorrow, guys. Won't be tomorrow. It's okay. Thank you very much
you're
for
welcome,
getting on
Matthew.
relatively early, for speaking to us, for speaking to me, to speaking to us. Thank you, viewers, for plugging in. Much appreciated. So share, like, do what you like. It's all good. We'll see you soon. Nor, nice one, mate. Take care. We'll see you soon, even if it's only in the virtual space of the Zoom world. All right.
You too, Matthew. Take care.
See ya.
Bye.